beginning of the 20th century, something happened to America. Teddy Roosevelt. He was an explosion upon the political scene. Dynamic, outspoken, warm, colorful, exciting, inspiring. Bursting with vitality, he was a man of action, a fighter, a leader of men. And under the surface was a man of ideals, with a passionate belief in America, its people, and its principles. Today, by an act of Congress, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of his birth, not merely to recall his greatness as our 26th president, but to be fired again by his numerous battles for truth and justice, and to remember that we in our time must be ready to fight similar battles if we are to remain free men.
On October 27, 1858, I was born at number 28 East 20th Street, New York City. Having been a sickly boy with no natural bodily prowess, and having lived much at home, I was at first quite unable to hold my own when thrown into contact with other boys of rougher antecedents. I was nervous and timid. Accordingly, with my father's approval, I started to learn to box. I did a good deal of boxing and wrestling in Harvard, but never attained to the first rank in either.
The struggle to gain physical fitness helped to make the man. He entered politics and was elected to the state assembly. In Albany, he was not only the youngest assemblyman, but probably the most determined in behalf of reform. He took on all opposition, particularly Tammany, which was forced to look on helplessly as Roosevelt found legal ways of curtailing its power. But not all his interest was in politics. The rough and challenging life of the frontier had always appealed to him. He went west. His ranch years in the Dakota Badlands were a deep influence on his later career.
It was a land of vast, silent spaces, of lonely rivers, and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horseman. I do not believe that there ever was any life more attractive to a vigorous young fellow than life on a cattle ranch in those days. We knew toil and hardship, and hunger and thirst, and we saw men die violent deaths as they worked among the horses and cattle, or fought in evil feuds with one another. But it was a fine, healthy life, too. It taught a man self-reliance, hardihood, and the value of instant decision. I enjoyed the life to the full. In addition to my private duties, I sometimes served as deputy sheriff of the northern end of our county. I took in more than one man who was probably a better man than I was with both rifle and revolver. But in each case, I knew just what I wanted to do. And like David Harum, I did it first.
Soon he was occupied on another ranch. He brought a certain Western toughness to his new job as United States Civil Service Commissioner, holding firmly to the conviction that government jobs belong not to those who stormed the doors of Washington after an election demanding payment for services rendered, but to the qualified. His fight against favoritism is well remembered. His spirit still watches over our Civil Service Commission. During the 70s and 80s, New York City was already a metropolis, bright and thriving, bustling with progress. And in the following years, this city of wealth became a city of wonders. But during the gaiety that reached a peak in the 90s, a reform administration was elected in which Roosevelt was chosen as the new police commissioner. He went to work at the hardest job he had ever faced.
New York was a wide open town. The big bosses rolled in wealth. This was the situation when I came to Mulberry Street. The first fight I made was to keep politics absolutely out of the force. And not only politics, but every kind of improper favoritism.
The shake-up started. Cops were called before the board. Payments for advancement stopped. Favoritism stopped. There was no holding Roosevelt in his fierce desire to reform the city. Once he sank his teeth into a problem, he just wouldn't let go. Next, he was called back to Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Out west, he had learned preparedness, that a man's threat is empty unless he is ready to shoot. He began to strengthen the Navy, while a crisis was slowly developing in our relations with Spain. To guard American lives, the battleship Maine was ordered to Havana Harbor. The night of February 15, 1898. The Maine was blown up at her anchorage, and the United States and Spain were at war. Roosevelt's attitude reflected that of most Americans, except that he was more outspoken. He had argued that it was our duty to help Cuba. It was a time to make his words good by deeds. He volunteered and helped to organize the first volunteer cavalry, the Rough Riders. Some of the volunteers were old friends from the West, who, when the call came, were eager to be at his side.
I suppose every man tends to brag about his regiment, but it does seem to me that there never was a regiment better worth bragging about than ours.
To Teddy Roosevelt, the field of battle was the greatest challenge he had ever known. In the West, he had seen danger and had learned to face it. Now, his men felt his confidence, followed him, and fought with distinction in the famous Battle of San Juan Hill. The fighting was hard, but after 3 months, it was all over, and America had found a new hero. He was quickly picked to run for governor of New York. He plunged into the race with his usual spirit. Then Teddy was elected. The opposition tried desperately to take over control, but while governor, the reins were firmly in his hands. By now a national figure, he was stampeded into becoming a candidate for Vice President of the United States. He accepted the nomination reluctantly. To friends, Roosevelt confided,
It would be an irksome, wearisome place where I could do nothing.
a dull job. And then a few months after election, President McKinley was assassinated. How long would it be before the nation felt the force of the new personality in the White House? There were a few quiet months. In particular, the work of conservation began. But an important issue was brewing. For some years, large corporations, by combining, had created efficiencies which helped in the vast and rapid development of the country. The railroads were but one example of how, by pooling resources, great strides could be achieved in a relatively short time. But now, in many industries, trusts had been formed, and almost before the country could realize it, some of them had grown powerful and dangerous. The question was before the nation. Were the great concentrations of capital to become more powerful than the government itself? The struggle to regulate the trusts was to be a long one, in which Roosevelt was to take active part. He was ready for the roundup. Restraint of trade was wrong. The law was on his side. The opposition protested hotly, letting off much steam in its defense. Roosevelt stood firmly on the ground that law and government must be supreme. His intention was never to hamper big business, but to enforce the law, which he did. Now, Mr. Businessman, rates are too high. They must come down. Safety must be guaranteed. I hope I impress my meaning on you. Good day. He was a whirlwind in office, taking as his motto a South African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." Was Roosevelt going too far with his big stick policies? Not if one understood his deep purpose. The enforcement of the law against monopolies proved that in this country, authority was truly in the hands of government. When he used the big stick, exercising the executive power invested in him by the people, he knew that they were behind him. They were the real power in America. Re-elected to a second term, he prepared his message to Congress. It was a lively message, but Congress was balky. Naturally, Roosevelt hastened to prepare new messages. They came fast and furious, in favor of workmen's compensation and pure food laws, against child labor abuses and bribery and corruption in federal elections.
By far the most important action I took in foreign affairs during the time I was president related to the Panama Canal. There had been a good deal of talk about building an isthmus canal for the previous half-century. I intended to do the job once and for all. After a sufficient period of wrangling, the Senate ratified the treaty with Panama and work on the canal was begun.
He went to the canal himself, and engineers and ditch diggers came to realize through him the importance and grandeur of the work, and became more determined than ever that it be accomplished. Roosevelt was able to see that the canal was vital to America's future as a great power. And he seemed to have a sixth sense about America's future in another realm. He approved the purchase from the Wright brothers of the first military airplane ever bought by a government. Characteristically, he risked his life by going aloft himself.
In my own judgment, the most important service that I rendered to peace was the voyage of the battle fleet around the world. I had become convinced that the Pacific was as much our home waters as the Atlantic, and that our fleet could and would at will pass from one to the other of the two great oceans.
The trip had been a success. America had gained new respect as a naval power. His term of office was almost over. Roosevelt was growing restless. He just couldn't sit still. Finally, his term expired and he was off to Africa to hunt. In the animal kingdom, there was an immediate reaction when word got around that Teddy was on his way. In a tour of Europe, kings and peoples were overwhelmed by his charm and vigor. Europe, to say the least, was impressed. Then one day, America learned that he was coming home. And soon he was asked to become a candidate for a third term. But then there was disagreement on major party principles, and Roosevelt and his followers broke away. Shortly after, a new third party was born. It was very much his own. Its political symbol, the bull moose. but the bull moose was defeated. In 1914, war threatened Europe. Roosevelt urged a full preparedness and was violently opposed by many Americans who thought their country could exist in isolation. He pleaded for realism. The Germans were beginning their sweep across Europe. They couldn't be halted by peace overtures, by words on paper. We needed trained men who were also prepared in their mind and heart for the duty ahead. Roosevelt made enemies. They called him militaristic, a jingo. As soon as war was declared, he went to the White House, offering to lead a division similar to the Rough Riders. He was refused. Then Quentin, his youngest son, was killed in action. Though saddened by the blow, Roosevelt continued to tour the country in behalf of the Liberty Loan Drive. He was dedicated to his mission, America's winning of the war. Victory came, and for weeks the country's happiness overflowed. And then, suddenly, there was the tremendous sense of loss that comes to a nation when one of its great men passes on. It was impossible to sum him up, but one word helped better than any other. The house at Sagamore Hill was quiet. This house where things were always happening, where the Roosevelt family lived a full, joyous, and exciting life with a father who enjoyed this role more than any other. The rooms here are rich in memories of hunting adventures, of yarns the president would tell, of ranching days, of colorful friends in the Rough Riders. Today there are those who can remember the stirring personality of Teddy Roosevelt, who can still hear that energetic, impassioned voice speaking out with its old vigor from the porch at Sagamore Hill.
The fate of the 20th century, as it bears on the world, will in no small degree depend upon the type of citizenship developed on this continent. I ask that we meet the many problems with which we are confronted from without and from within, with a wise, fearless, and a resolute desire to make of this nation, in the end, as the centuries go by, the example for all the nations of the earth, a nation in which we shall see the spirit of peace and of justice incarnate.
While he had lived, something did happen to America. But more to be remembered than his achievements is the passion with which he upheld basic American beliefs and principles, and the way he brought alive a similar spirit in others. Together with our greatest leaders, he still moves among us. Always our great need is for his kind of idealism, willingness, and courage.